Let me begin by pointing out what I hope is obvious. The world is constantly changing, and everything about the world has changed. Indeed, it has changed in many big and important ways, and continues to change in big and important ways. This is where I begin, and in many ways, as you will see, this is where I end. Everything has changed. Everything we've learned through experience and been taught growing up has changed. It's not just that we are experiencing a lot of change. That should be obvious. It's that everything has changed, and to succeed in today's world, we have to learn new ways to function. In the words of recent major business leaders, Paul Allaire, former CEO of Xerox, said, "We are in a brawl with no rules." Steve Case, co-founder of AOL, said there will be more confusion in the business world in the next decade than in any decade in history. And Jack Welch, famous prior CEO of General Electric, said, when the rate of change on the outside exceeds the rate of change on the inside, then the end for the organization is in sight. And I would add that this is the situation in most organizations today. Businesses in every industry, as well as all governments, are facing more change and disruption than ever. Some people refuse to recognize the changes and their impacts, and often want to return to a prior time before the changes, while others recognize the opportunities that are present in the changes and are excited about the challenges these changes present. Let me describe this in a short overview of human history. For tens of thousands of years, for at least a couple 100,000 years, but nevertheless for just a tiny fraction of Earth time, and yet for pretty close to all of our human history, we survived through what is referred to as living in a culture of hunting and gathering. That is, we survived through eating basically what nature provided, living in small groups, since that is all that hunting and gathering would support, and moving around to follow the plants and animals. This continued for somewhere around 100 to 200,000 years. However, during the last 10 to 20,000 years or so, or until fairly close to the current time, we learned to grow and graze our food, which led to the possibility for people living together in larger numbers, in villages and towns, of differing sizes and forms, supported by agriculture, farming, and grazing. Almost everybody was occupied in food creation and preparation. And then, as recently as only a couple 100 years ago, we figured out how to create and capture energy and began to use technology to replace human effort to keep ourselves alive. Thus, in a very tiny slice of human history, about 300 to 500 years ago in England, and not many more than 100 to 200 years ago in the US, and even fewer years in many other countries, the Industrial Revolution replaced farmers with factory workers. Nevertheless, many people have a hard time accepting and understanding what has happened to manufacturing and extraction jobs in this historically natural evolution from agriculture to a new epoch of work, to manufacturing and industrial jobs, and then to service jobs, and now to computer-driven work. Politicians and reporters constantly ask what happened to farming and coal mining and factories and even service jobs. They want to blame some type of purposeful conspiracy against workers. But in a pattern that has been followed in every country in the world, although in varying time frames, but in all cases only in very recent years, what people do for a living has evolved from primarily agriculture to primarily industrial to primarily service to primarily technology-driven work, and now heavily to also include leisure time jobs and healthcare jobs. Over a relatively short period of time, 200 to 300 years, pretty much every country's economy has or is evolving. Not every country has made the complete evolution. Every country seems to go through this evolution, albeit in varying time periods. But the critical point of understanding is that these transitions are not caused by any conspiracy, but rather by the development of new technologies. And yes, some people lose their jobs as the new technologies require new skills, but in a relatively short period of time, the workforce adjusts and acquires the basic education and new skills necessary for the new economic requirements. And most importantly, and necessary to understand and accept, all of this happens while we grow more food than ever, we manufacture more goods than ever, we innovate more than ever, and we've lowered global poverty down to about 15% of the ever-growing global population. And this occurs while every new generation successfully copes with new issues and concerns. The point of this history lesson is to reinforce why I think we need to focus our attention on the nature of global change. Therefore, I want to turn my attention to some of the forces that have and still do cause these changes. Over time, there are a number of forces at work that result in these types of changes. What I would like to do is discuss what I consider to be the most important and strongest forces for change today. These are the forces that managers of businesses and government agencies need to assess as to their impacts on their particular organizations, so they can develop strategies for combating or taking advantage of the disruptions they cause. For my purposes today, I will describe what I consider to be the 6 most important sources of change and disruption. The first source for change and disruption that I want to address is globalization and increasing global competition. Globalization began to develop strongly in the last century and continues to grow in importance today, even though a return to nationalism has become a popular theme in the new politics in the last couple of years, with efforts to pull back from international trade treaties and global business in many developed countries. The reality continues to be constantly increasing trade and continually increasing forms of international connectedness, a process that has resulted in rising standards of living for millions, if not billions, of people. A few years ago, the term BRIC was coined to enable an easier way to refer to the growing size and influence of 4 particular developing economies: Brazil, Russia, India, and China, which all have large populations and growing economies. Brazil and Russia have struggled during the last couple of years, but they still have large populations and important economies. And of course, India and China have become major global economic players, with China now being the world's 2nd largest economy. Also, during the last few years, the largest growth in country and regional economies has occurred in Southeast Asia, made up of a number of medium-sized developing countries, yet with fast-growing economies. For example, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Taiwan, the Philippines, and Singapore. In addition, there are also many other medium-sized economies that are developing rapidly and that are expanding the overall global GDP, such as South Africa, Nigeria, and Mexico, among others. To further support the point of the importance of globalization, in 1950, the U.S. produced over half, 53%, of global GDP and was home to 75 of the top 100 global companies. However, today in 2018, even though the U.S. economy is still the world's largest, it produces less than 15% of global GDP, and fewer than 20 of the world's largest 100 firms are now American, with the rest coming from more than 30 other countries. In all ways, economics is now global, and ownership of businesses is now global, with stockholders from every country, as is also true of the location of their customers. Of course, global commerce is now also not just about large firms anymore either. It now includes small to medium-sized firms from everywhere that are now participating. For example, do you have a website? If so, you're global. People from anywhere in the world can and will contact you. When Amazon was first created, having given no thought to servicing customers outside its home country, the U.S., it all of a sudden found itself in the first week servicing customers from at least 45 countries. And now it services customers in all 195 countries around the world. Of course, in addition to this, many new businesses are born global. All of this just reinforces the necessity to participate in and cope with the many changes that arise from this first of the forces for change. The second force for radical change that I want to address is the power and prevalence of the ongoing technological and communication revolutions. The company stability of the 1950s and 1960s gave way to rapid, unpredictable change, with once stalwart firms beginning to be purchased, merged, or put out of business at a faster and faster rate. Adaptability and entrepreneurship became key to achieving and sustaining success, their importance growing as the spread of computers and software imposed Moore's Law, the concept that the power of microchips would double approximately every 2 years and the cost would reduce by half on every corner of the economy. For example, this technological revolution enables everyone with an internet connection to connect with billions of people around the world, sharing ideas and products and services and learning from others. Never before in human history have so many people been connected in so many ways for so many purposes. To further illustrate the power of Moore's Law, Intel's current CEO, Brian Krzanich, explains its impact through this example. If you took Intel's first-generation microchip from 1971 and the latest chip Intel has on the market in 2018, the sixth-generation Intel Core processor, you will find that Intel's latest chip offers 3,500 times more performance, is 90,000 times more energy efficient, and is about 60,000 times lower in cost, all within about 45 years. The third force for change that I want to address is the new demographic profile of countries. For the first time in history, the populations of some countries are rapidly aging and indeed beginning to shrink because more people are dying from old age than are being born to replenish their populations. In addition, these countries now have more old people than young people for the first time in history and have to deal with all the issues that creates for society, such as for education, housing, health care, and elderly care. In much of the developed world, there is now a labor shortage, such that many firms find it difficult to hire enough employees who have the skills they require in their local labor pools. In these countries, the age group from 15 to 35, entry level and early career, is shrinking. From 45 to 65 is growing, but often lacks the skills and experience needed by the new technology. Thus, there are now more people retiring over the age of 65 than entering the labor force. In the U.S., there are now 10,000 baby boomers who were born between 1945 and 1964, which is the largest single demographic group, retiring, leaving the labor force every day. These demographics have created a global war and competition for talent, and at the same time created a large demand for people with new skills, such as medical and healthcare for the rapidly increasing elderly, as well as leisure activities for a healthy elderly population. The next force for change that I want to mention is the increased political and social conservatism around the world. This nationalistic conservatism is changing the face of government in many countries, such as putting pressure on the government to reduce its role in the economy, reducing overall regulation, i.e. creating deregulation, reducing social spending, turning social programs such as Social Security, health care, insurance, infrastructure, and parks and public lands into privatized non-governmental programs, supporting free trade and using tariffs to ensure perceived fairness between countries, and limiting conservation, opening up parks and other preserved territories to mining and drilling and other forms of use that were not allowed under the original purposes of conservation. An additional component of this nationalism is the desire to limit immigration, which in a world with major conflicts continues to grow and put pressure on companies and countries in what many now view as undesirable ways. I add to this list of forces for change the growing impact of global surprises, many of which are directly caused by global warming, such as rising ocean water levels, historically long droughts, declining water levels, melting glaciers, and large unexpected natural events, larger than expected and larger than experienced before, and which are often also linked to global warming. Hurricanes, tornadoes, monsoons, monster storms, large fires, earthquakes, tsunamis. The costs to deal with these consequences and events are becoming larger than governments and firms are prepared to handle. And given today's connectedness, increasingly such events have global consequences, affecting everyone, every company, and every government. These forces for change can seem daunting and are not going away. Here are a few of the consequences. There's no place to hide. These forces affect all of us, everywhere. They create constantly increasing expectations as to what needs to be done by you and by everyone else, and what is desired. The best products, services, performance can and does come from anywhere and everywhere. So let's take a deeper look at some of these. Constantly increasing expectations. Where do they come from? Many people develop expectations for example, better jobs, higher standards of living, because they are exposed to these things through working abroad, millions of people, traveling abroad, billions of people, more than 1 billion people cross borders every year in airplanes. Many more, of course, in cars, trains, boats, and on foot. Forced and voluntary emigration, millions every year. Emigration for work and school. Global communication, primarily but not limited to TV, incredible amount of social networking and internet, movies, music, and the impact and proliferation of global multinational enterprises, or MNEs. The only competitive advantage comes from a highly skilled and productive workforce. All of these forces for change have also led to the creation of new organizations, created to facilitate the changes required by all of these expectations. Their characteristics include flatter, with fewer layers, less hierarchy, smaller, borderless between departments, functions, between firms and their customers, between countries, partnered, temporary, fast-paced, less tangible, modular, informal networks, and totally connected, delayered, downsized, etc. And in terms of impact on employment, work has changed from long-term employment to short-term project work, serving in many different careers, and selfpreneurship. Speed, complexity, diversity, and a global mindset, or for some, a renewed local nationalistic mindset. This reality that everything has changed underlies all of our attitudes and behaviors, whether we are aware of it or not. What I am hoping to get you to recognize is that this understanding is key to acting appropriately in today's chaotic and so often disruptive environment. You need to give your passion over to doing and learning what you need to survive and thrive in this new environment. This involves a devotion to constant self-development, as well as the development of everyone around you. Team development, innovation, and networking, helping others and willingness to being helped. Thank you.